the racial makeup of their customer base. They certainly don't know it in the context of rating. They might be able to figure it out in some marketing thing, but they don't know. And so one of the big beefs that the insurance industry had in the United States when they were asked about the impact of rating on different racial groups is, we don't know, and we don't want to know. We don't ask, don't tell, we're out of it. As we move forward and try and study outputs and what the rate means in different communities, it seems like we're going to have to do something really challenging, which is connect that rate to someone's, place in society. Gender is easy, but and getting harder, right? So gender, sexual orientation, race, there's all sorts of things. And I'm trying to imagine a poor Black or Hispanic person in downtown area in a poor community, and someone says to them, I want to record your race for the insurance company because we're here to help. And why that person is going to be skeptical is pretty clear. How do we go about that delicate challenge of doing this analysis of trying to figure out how it impacts communities when we don't really know?
Yeah. So the short answer is very carefully.
Yeah.
The slightly longer answer that may not be any more illuminating is that we are still doing the work in Ontario around doing the research to actually understand where or if we can identify vulnerable groups and who they are, right? And I'm looking at Ivy now. She's leading a lot of that research. We've got a partnership with Queen's University on one. We've got a partnership with another group on another. We're doing some of our own work. So that's kind of job one, is do we understand where the vulnerability is today? I'm sure we all have an opinion about that, but there's not a whole lot of data. So I think we've got to start there before we can start making any decisions about what are the kind of things we would need to do to actually put it into practice. But that research is in progress. I don't know how many that we've got concurrently right now, Ivy, probably 3 studies. 3 studies underway right now. So we're actually doing the work, and guess what? Nobody's ever done this work.
Yeah.
So
yeah. It's a little scary. It's kind of embarrassing. Roosevelt, you've done this work. You've actually taken a stab at analyzing rates as it relates to race. Maybe without going too far into the actuarial weeds, you can give a little idea of how you've gone about that, at least in these early stages of research.
Yeah. So the data question is always one of the first ones that comes up. And I will be the first to say it's not an easy answer. It's a challenging question, but it's not impossible. So I get the fact that it's not information that we typically as an industry collect, or that we want to collect for a lot of different reasons. But to the extent, and I'm speaking some from the US, and I suspect this may be similar here in Canada, we've gotten to the point in the US especially that I don't have the data is not going to be a sufficient answer going forward. And that's just where we are. And so we're going to have to accept that reality and figure out how to move forward. Now, there have been a few different approaches that have tried to approximate what some of that sensitive information looks like. And those approaches, admittedly, and I'll be the first to say it, come with some level of error that we're going to have to accept. But someone said earlier, let's not necessarily let perfect be the enemy of good. The fact that we're now able to begin taking steps toward something that allows us to definitively say, yes, there's a problem, or no, there isn't, then again, lays the basis for the conversation of how we move forward. But again, especially in the US, there's been a lot of contention about, yes, we can, no, we can't, yes, we can, no, we can, and it's really not getting us anywhere. But one of the things that we did using some of those approaches is actually incorporate a few different methodologies that have been discussed related to how you do it either at an individual variable level, which I don't love, or how you do it at a more holistic level. You're looking at the ultimate outcomes and applying those methods to insurance data. And essentially what we're finding is while there might be some areas that we might want to poke at a little more, there really isn't a whole lot to see here. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be the case across the industry, but it feels to me at least that had we been able to engage more constructively early on, we might be at a better place where it isn't so contentious and we're worried about where the outcomes are going to take us. So it is doable. We have started to look at it in the US because regulation is beginning to require us to look at it, and it's going to require more of us to look at it. But the answer is, the question is answerable. It's just we're taking a step in the right direction. The answer is not going to be perfect, but it's going to continue to get better.
Let me try one of the things the audience may not be aware. Last September, my organization hosted an insurance fairness forum, and basically brought consumer groups and regulators and insurers together to try and define terms and plot a bit of a course forward. And we kind of hammered down to two things that needed to be done. The first is a pretty basic question. Are prices accurately matched to loss costs? Or are some groups paying more than they should purely based on some social component? So basic question. Are poor Blacks in an inner city paying a higher auto insurance premium than their loss cost should dictate? That would be your classic definition of bias, right? I don't think anybody's got any problem with that. And at the moment, no one knows the answer to that. So Roosevelt was describing the process that we went through to try and identify, is that a factor? And the early studies were no. For those of you who are lay people like myself, one of the techniques that are used to identify someone's race is they actually look at their first and last name. And all the actuaries and all the numbers people in the room were totally cool with it. And all the lay people were like, ooh, that sounds awful. So I'll just tell you that that's part of the play, is that you have to become comfortable with very strange things. So that's job one. Is this rate actuarially sound, or is race or some other protected characteristic driving up the price, either because of intentional bias, which I think the most aggressive consumer group in the room, no one says that they think anyone's doing it intentionally. But as Carol discussed, you wind up with models based on historical things that wind up with an unintentional error in that it charges too much. So that's sort of step one. That's almost easy. Not easy, almost easy. Step two is the harder one, and this goes back to what Tim mentioned at the top, is that you have structural failures in society that come from historical disasters in this. I mean, in the US, you have a couple hundred years of slavery. You have populations being shoved off into different corners economically for all sorts of reasons. None of it good, but it's all real. And so you have people who are, as Tim said, you have risk laying disproportionately across society. So I'm paying more because I live in a high crime neighborhood, legit, based on loss costs. But I live in a high crime neighborhood because my parents got shoved here, not by choice, not by desire and a wish to get out. What role does insurance play in trying to mitigate that social failure? And it goes back to Tim's early comment. So we'll start with Tim and we'll work our way across to Carol. But Tim, when you look at those two, the current, I'm interested in your take, the current efforts are aimed at number one. Are you charging someone too much relative to their loss costs just because of some protected characteristic? And then what do you think of that second job? You said at the top, you don't think we should play, but there's a lot of demand for that. What do you think might happen there?
Well, on the first one, I think this is part of the point of some of the research that we're doing, is to try to get underneath and see if we can actually come up with some sort of definitive answer. So that's is there unintentional or intentional bias as predicted by a loss cost relative to the premium, right? We'll do that work. I'd have a bet on that or another. I know I'm not supposed to say, James. I might. On the second matter of the social aspect, I do think that's difficult. However, I also speak with a lot of people in this room on a regular basis. One of the things that you can do in insurance, I mean, people here will say we can price anything, but put it above board, right? And allow me to price for the risk, and then make an intentional decision about where you want to have more favorable terms, for instance, right? That's part of addressing it, potentially. So I'll pick a reasonably non-contentious one. I think they're all contentious, by the way, but let's just say for a moment that it was in Ontario's interest that younger drivers got a better deal than they deserve based on the risk they present. That's a policy decision. That's one an entire industry could get behind if everybody had to play by the same rules, right? And you knew the deal. None of those, we're not there yet, but I think that is available if we want to go there. And that's a heck of a lot better than the unintentional cross-subsidization that goes on all over the place, or perhaps some of the things the industry complains about, where you can't actually get the right rate because of prohibitions or restrictions in the current rate regulation regime. So I'd much rather we take the restrictions off and allow you to get comfort you can get the right price, and then lay on top of that, here are the groups or the people that we think from a policy perspective need more favorable terms. That would be my take on it. And then,
Well, so wait, before I let you get in there, the one caveat to all that, Tim, is that you have to accept that when you start to monkey with pure rating, you get unintended consequences. So my favorite story, well, not favorite, but a useful story is Michigan really tried to lower its urban rates at the expense of suburban rates. So they tried to get suburban drivers paying more, urban drivers paying less. This was a social desire, makes a lot of sense. The problem is that they went too far, and all the agents fled downtown Detroit. And now availability dries up, and insurers stop marketing. Now, and then they tried, okay, we're going to force you to write there. It doesn't work. So it's a very tricky thing when you start down that road. I'm not saying it can't be done. Every time a carrier says to me, you can't mess with the free market, I point out there are already a bunch of prohibited characteristics. In most of the US, well, maybe most, but a lot of states in the US, you can't use gender. You just can't. In all states in the US, you can't use race, national origin, religious. There are lots of prohibited factors, and everything's fine. But if you especially start to monkey with territory, life gets really, the law of unintended consequences comes and bites you. So it's nothing's easy. Nothing's easy. Okay, sorry, had to get my soapboxes around here somewhere. So go ahead, Roosevelt.
So I'm actually going to build off what you just said there, because and try to mesh your 2 points into one, because for me it's a continuum. So starting from your point, which is completely accurate, a number of things that we have agreed as a society, as an industry, that we will not do, that we cannot use. I can't price on race, even if it's predictive. I can't consider someone's income, even if it's predictive. And so we've agreed on that, and no one's standing up banging on their soapbox saying, I want to use these characteristics. And so then if I take that to the next step, let's say I could find a characteristic or series of acceptable characteristics that would get me to the same place as using one of these prohibited characteristics would get me. And I often ask the question, is that okay? And the wheels start turning a bit, but I think at some point, most people get to the place where they think the answer is still no, because regardless of how I get there, I'm getting to a place where I say I won't as a society. Well, unfortunately, life isn't that clean and clear cut, and there's no one variable, probably not necessarily a collection of variables, that will get me all the way to where a prohibited characteristic would. But then the question becomes, and this is part of the policy question, the question becomes, how far is too far? how close to that line can I get, kind of like Icarus, how close can I get before I scorch myself? And that's the part where regulators, where policymakers are going to have to answer that question. I, as a math guy, I can tell you how close you are. It's going to be someone else to determine whether that's acceptable or not. And so maybe it's coming all the way back to your question, Brian, I think it's really kind of a meld or a combination of the two pieces that you described. Absolutely, prices have to be reflective of risk. And I think for the most part, at least everywhere I tend to look, the industry is doing a better job of that because competition is demanding it. If you're not trying to match price to risk, you're going to get exposed in the market pretty quickly. I then can take this next step of saying, how close am I to a place where we all agree as an industry we shouldn't go? And if the answer is too close, then we've got another conversation to have.
So I'm wondering if we could just take a minute and take some questions from the audience, both digitally and live. I'm hoping, I'm sorry, I'm looking away from all of you. I'm hoping that either the questions come in the chat or somebody will jump in and ask the question from online. And then let's leave a little bit of time for each of you to wrap up at the end. Right. So do we have a good question locally?
Yeah, here in the room, we've got microphones. And so just raise your hand and we'll, there, Ryan down here in the middle has a question. So we've got one in the room, Brian.
Okay.
How's that? Ryan Stein with Definity Insurance. First off, just want to say it was a very insightful panel, really interesting discussion, and it sounds like what you're moving towards, or what we're moving towards, is quite foundational and quite a big change with the emphasis on fairness, the emphasis on outputs. And I just wanted to get your insight and comments on what is the type of regulatory structure that's kind of built around that to ensure that those outcomes are being achieved.
Yeah, I guess I get to start, but I bet everybody's got a view on some of that. So, I mean, where we would start with this, and we really are at the start, right? So I can't emphasize that enough. This isn't a get buy-in session for what everybody's already decided. It's in fact the opposite of that. But I think it does start with getting to what we believe is a workable definition of fairness. And that, as Roosevelt said earlier, that includes having everybody at the table. And we're talking to real consumers, and I mean real consumers, which means none of us, right? We're not, and we're getting their input because it matters, because they're a pretty critical stakeholder. And historically, nobody's bothered to ask. Not really, right? Typically ask people who say they represent consumers. Those aren't the same thing. So I think we start there. And then that fairness, we're making a big deal of it today, and I think we should, but it's one pillar of our rate and underwriting regulation reform framework, right? The other is are more about enabling people to get the information they need, kind of around transparency and so forth. And the other is sort of an efficient regulation, right? So all three of those pillars would form part of any reformed regime that we'd come up with. And you heard a lot again about principles-based regulation. So that definition of fairness and maybe some of the things that go into it, those other two pillars of the strategy would get wrapped into a principles-based framework on which to operate. And as I said before, the current rate regulation regime that is still, in spite of Kong's best efforts, very heavily focused on rating inputs more than consumer outcomes, needs a rethink in that context, just like the work that you're doing needs a rethink in that context. And I think Mark spoke about management accountability. Well, the management accountability, do you have robust risk management frameworks in place? Are you managing your models in such a way that you can give the regulator comfort that you may not know what goes on inside the box, but you're very clear on your process for model management and how you govern it, and that you've got an eye on the outcomes, right? That's probably closer to where we're going. And for the companies that demonstrate that competency consistently and the ability to meet regulatory expectations, there'll probably be some benefits of that. More flexibility, perhaps more streamlined rate regulation processes, because we know you've got a handle on it, and FSRA will pay extra attention to the areas or the organizations that frankly earn more attention. But that would be my sense of it, Ryan, if that helps.
Maybe the only thing I'll add is that there's increasingly complex, the only thing I'll add is that there's probably increasingly complex overlapping laws. So you're now having laws that are sectoral based, you're having laws that are governing the inputs, those data inputs, you're having laws that are governing the technology. It's becoming much more, the regulatory landscape is becoming much more complicated because we see data, those inputs, as such a valuable asset and the risks associated with how they're used. So when you think about the two sort of sides that Brian was talking about, the first of unintended consequences, that's a do no harm, right? The second is, can we actually do something that is good? So you're trying to shape, use law and policy to shape society for the better, which is a lot harder to do. But as we look at what those different data inputs look like, and there will be different data inputs that will force us to rethink the extent to which we need race, ethnicity, language, or other types of inputs for the analysis. You know, I just want to be really thoughtful about the fact that you've got quite complex regulatory framework that's emerging, and it's very fluid. So just in Canada alone, we've got a whole bunch of different privacy and data laws. We have federal, potentially in some cases, provincial types of laws that are governing different kinds of technologies. So it's not to make it impossible, it's just that it is quite complicated and overlapping.
Carol, maybe you could address this, a question from the audience, and while you're answering, it'll give Tim a minute to come up with what he's going to say. So I'll read it to you. It just says, how will FSRA's regulatory approach to rate fairness mesh with the regulatory framework being created under the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act?
Yeah.
Is the goal for FSRA to complement or supplement the federal regime for Ontario auto insurance rates?
I want to be really clear about the AIDA. Number one, it regulates high impact technologies. Number two, it does not define what high impact technologies means. So we actually don't know what it regulates yet. And I'm not saying that to that's actually, we're going to find out apparently in the next few weeks. We're going to get some guidance from the feds on that, but we don't actually know. The second thing is it very clearly tries to extend the jurisdiction by talking about the systems that are made for the purposes of interprovincial or international trade, which is establishing federal jurisdiction of this particular law, where otherwise it's effectively regulating areas of provincial jurisdiction. So how they will work together is still very much a big question mark, because we're not entirely clear how it will operate. It's a very high level law and it's very broad. It has some really important ministerial oversight. So it actually has quite a bit of teeth. It has criminal implications associated with it, which is not something that I would have expected to see necessarily, but it is still fairly high level, and there is a lot that is left to the regulation, which we have not seen yet. So it's very hard to answer that question, but it is simply to flag that this is something that needs to be that you need to keep your eye on, because it is, as I said, very fluid and increasingly sort of coming into the provincial jurisdiction, including in areas such as insurance. Tim?
Well, I'd be more than delighted if somebody other than us came up with all of the guidance necessary. I really would, because there are certain things we're best at, but at the same time, that may or may not happen, or it may or may not happen in the timing that's in front of us. I think what's really important for us is that, Ivy did this with our operational risk management guidance that came out for your information recently, is we knew there was another regulator that was doing some work similarly, not called the same thing, but it was similar. And she was very personally involved and in touch with what they were doing. And so when we issued that, we had some comfort that it was consistent. And just because we issue it, if it becomes inconsistent or out of date, it's within our gift to withdraw it in place of something perhaps that's better. And that would be ideal. And because clearly the world is moving, and we will probably in the short term trip over each other a little bit. I think it's more about the commitment to what do we do when that happens, as opposed to, bury your head in the sand, or somehow my ego is attached to our guidance and it's going to win the day over somebody else's. I think that's really the commitment we have to make is, right? Once, say it once should be enough.
So Tim, we only have a couple more minutes, so you get the final spot here. Is there a thought you want to leave this audience with? It's your guys' party, right? So you get to say the last word. What is it you want to leave everyone with?
Well, first, just to thank these two and you, Brian, for being here. I said to everybody, the stars of the show are two of the people on the stage, and they're not me. So Carol, Roosevelt, thank you. Brian, as always, it's a joy. And to everybody here, thank you for being part of this on a day that, for those of you virtually joining, in Toronto today, it's started with some snow and then apparently freezing rain, and still you're here. And for those of you who joined virtually, thank you for that as well. I will close with sort of a bit of a pitch, I guess, if I could. We are, in my view, down the road of a once-in-a-career opportunity. And I don't mean my career, I mean for everybody. Right now, the entire rate regulation framework created in 1990, right, is in scope for reform. And 1990 is getting to be a long time ago, right? So it's not happening someday, it's in progress right now. And as much as we have a lot of work left to do, I mean, clearly, like in defining fairness in a way that is practical, the more time we spend on this, and we've been at this, as Brian alluded to, at FSRO, we've been talking about this for 3 years now and doing real work on it. The more time we spend on it, the more confident I am that we're gonna be able to find something that works for industry and works for consumers and works for the regulator, and something everybody can support. And there are lots of reasons for that, not the least of which is this group. You continuously come to the table prepared to collaborate with us and look for the right answer for your customers, not just your customers, but Ontarians more broadly. And that's really what this kind of work is going to take. So I guess where I'll end is, if you're not talking yet about fairness in your organization, and I know many of you are, but if you're not, please get started, because your customers are talking about it, and we're talking to them, and we need your help to get this right. And so with that in mind, we're out right now having meetings with organizations like yours to start talking through some of this. I'm looking at Jonas right now, he's leading a lot of that work. If your meeting's not yet in the calendar, please don't leave today without us getting a date. And thank you.